Okay. Lesson 8, this will be our last lesson in the Old Testament. Next week, my aim is to start looking at the Gospels and start looking at what Jesus came into, what confronted Jesus when he became incarnate and at the time of his ministry. So we'll get there next week. If you haven't got a question sheet, I'm sure David will hand you one if we run out. Maybe run a few more off. I want to look at several passages that allude to Satan. By the way, I didn't finish last week's lesson. First Chronicles 1:21. What's unique about that passage? First Chronicles 21:1. It's the occasion where Satan incited David to take a census of the men of Israel. Anyone?
What's your question?
What's unique about that passage? First Chronicles 21:1. It's the only passage in the Old Testament that seems to call Satan by name. In other words, there's no definite article before the word adversary. He's just called Satan. But there's two passages of scripture. There's First Chronicles 21:1, which tells us that Satan was the one motivating King David to sin against God's will, because Israel was told who was in charge of their army, who would fight their battles. Wow. God would. So they shouldn't put their faith in horses, chariots, or counting the number of men that were available to them. They shouldn't put their trust in their forces. Okay? They should put their trust in God. So Satan's the one denoted as inciting David there. But there's another passage of scripture that also covers this event, and that's 2 Samuel 24 and verse 3. It says something rather different. This parallel passage would seem to claim that 2 Samuel 24 and verse 3. And if you're there, read it, because I haven't got it handy. 2 Samuel 24, verse 3. Anyone there yet?
But Joab replied to the king, May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king want to do such a thing?
So even Joab recognizes that the king is doing something very wrong. Verse 1 says, of chapter 24:1, again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against who?
Israel.
And he incited David against them. Who's the he? Looking at the context of the verse, it would appear that it's Jehovah, it's God. Now, why would those two passages seem to have different people inciting David to do the same thing? Can that be, or do we need to throw our Bibles in the bin and say, we've just found something that doesn't add up? Or could it be that on this rare occasion, God's plans and Satan's plans are in alignment? How would that be? How would that be? Look at verse 1 again.
God probably used Satan to talk to David.
Yes, that's what I think's happening here, because the anger of the Lord was again kindled against Israel. What seems to be the situation in Israel's covenant relationship with God at that time, late in David's reign? It's not good, is it? And so perhaps God's fixing to judge them. And so God is allowing Satan to test David. And what's amazing is Joab, who's a really quite a worldly person, his head general, who oftentimes, on his deathbed, David will say to his son Solomon, do not let that guy's grey hair go down to Sheol without, sorting him out, kill him, in other words. he needs sorting out. So Joab's not a perfect guy at all, and yet he even recognizes and rebukes David for what he's about to do. So that's how I reconcile those two passages. Okay, so that was what I didn't get to last week. But what's the most obvious passage of scripture in the Old Testament that seems to allude to Satan without mentioning his name directly? Garden of Eden, yes. Genesis chapter 3. And so you probably are so used to thinking, oh, that's Satan, that you don't even give it a second thought. But it doesn't mention his name, doesn't call him the devil or anything there. Okay, and I want to share with you why it's okay for us to believe that it is Satan. There's a number of reasons beyond our New Testament understanding and looking back. The serpent in the passage is simply described as, in verse 1 of chapter 3 of Genesis, being more crafty. Some versions say subtle, others say cunning. Okay, I want you to keep those three words in your mind, okay? Keep that thought. He's more crafty, he's more cunning than all the other beasts that God had made, okay? And then he proceeds to deceive Eve about God's character and about her own potential and about the promise of the forbidden fruit in verses 2 to 4. And then in verse 6 and following, the serpent influences her to disobey God. We all know the story. As a consequence of this deception, the serpent is going to be cursed. And look at what God says in verse 14 and 15. What does he say? He'll be cursed above
all livestock and wild animals.
Yeah. You'll be cursed above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. That's kind of important. Okay, because that's a distinction, I believe. To dismiss this narrative as merely some primitive story about how human life became cursed and how snakes came to crawl on the ground and supposedly eat dust and frighten humans, I think completely misses the point of the account in Genesis. Later, rabbis thought that this was a real creature that had limbs and was 2 foot high and blah, 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 could talk and all the rest of it. Maybe. I'm not arguing against that. But I don't think losing its limbs would stop it and make it a snake. Because what else could that serpent do? Talk and reason. And I don't think that escaped the attention of the writer, do you? So, I'm not with those theologians who bark at that tree. Early Christian writers, but before then, the writers who were between the two testaments, between the Old and the New Testament there, often referenced the serpent in their writings as being equivalent to the devil or Satan himself. I could give you a couple of passages, but I'm not going to. But to say that where is it? 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 and following. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam wasn't deceived, but the woman was totally deceived and became a transgressor. And there's an allusion there to very much Genesis, yes? The garden and the forbidden fruit. In Romans, at the end of the book of Romans 16, verse end of 19 and verse 20, I want you to be wise, Paul says, as to what is good, and innocent as to what is evil. The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. That seems to be a powerful allusion to the curse, doesn't it, in Genesis 3? It would seem to me. He's also called the tempter. in Matthew 4 verse 3 by Matthew, and in 1 Thessalonians 3:5, the tempter. So that's definitely alluding to something that happened in the garden, isn't it? What about the old serpent of Revelation 12:9, the big battle that took place in the heavens? Certainly would refer back to Genesis 3, but I also think it has a cosmic element to it, because I think it's a reference to Leviathan as well in some of those earlier, like Job and other earlier passages. So throughout church history, the serpent of Genesis 3 has been taken to refer to Satan, or at least to a beast that was at this time possessed by Satan. And that could be very plausible as well, I think, yes? Apart from the obvious theological grounds, though, for taking Genesis 3 to refer to Satan, and the numerous New Testament references to this passages, and we believe in the inspiration of Scripture, don't we? There are also other grounds for taking even the original meaning of this passage to refer to a demonic type creature. Firstly, it's not insignificant that demons and other cosmic anti-creation chaos beings were frequently pictured in the forms of serpents throughout Near Eastern cultures, those nations around Israel in ancient times. For example, the underworld deity, Ningishzida, is pictured as a venomous horned snake that is the guardian of the underworld demons, according to the Adapa myth. And that was a Mesopotamian god. There is also a strong connection between serpents and chaos and evil and destruction throughout those cultures. And I don't know about references to the fiery, in one case, I think it's in Isaiah 36, it talks about the flying fiery serpents Isaiah refers to, but we're certainly familiar with the fiery serpents that bit the Israelites. Do you remember they had to put up that bronze serpent in order to fend off those snakes? What were they? God sent them to judge the Israelites because of their grumblings. In Deuteronomy 8:15 and Numbers 21:6. Do those relate to types of demons in the Near Eastern cultures? I don't know. I don't know, but there's definitely some kind of link there. It would certainly seem that this serpent is intent on causing trouble. He wants chaos. He doesn't want the order of God's creation. And you know what? There's also another serpent in Canaanite religion that shouldn't be ignored, because he's mentioned in the Gospels. This serpent is called Zebul Baal, literally Prince Baal, Baal being the chief god of the Canaanites. He's called also Beelzebul. Does that sound kind of familiar? What did the Pharisees accuse Jesus of doing miracles in the power of? Beelzebul. Yeah, one and the same. One and the same. This Canaanite god, who would probably equate to the demonic prince of Canaan. Interestingly, the Genesis 3 text compares the serpent to maybe one, well, it compares him to, in that beginning of that curse, to animals and livestock, but it doesn't explicitly identify the serpent as a natural animal. It seems almost as if he sets the serpent apart from all the other creatures. And maybe that's because those other creatures are already shown as concluded in God's creation in chapter 1, yes? And on the day that they were created, God saw what had happened and he thought it was good, didn't he? Yeah. And so it seems like there's a cut-off there from these good qualities, because I don't associate cunning guile or craftiness as good quality, do you? To me, that's got a bad connotation to it. And so I don't associate this serpent, whether he was possessed by the devil or whatever he was. There's a distinction made by the writer, I think, in the Genesis account, and we shouldn't miss it. Oh, and by the way, do snakes literally crawl on their bellies and eat dust?
They slither.
They slither. Yeah, they don't really, do they? But if I told you that terminology is an idiom or an example of an idiom that's found a lot in Semitic Hebrew literature to describe humiliation, defeat, and things like that, just turn to Micah chapter 7, verse 17 quickly. Micah 7:17, because the writer there, I think, uses the exact allusion that we're talking about. Where is he? For Nahum. Okay, last chapter. He says, I'll read 16 as well. The nations shall see and be ashamed of all their might. They shall lay their hands on their mouths. Their ears shall be deaf. What are you picturing? They shall lick the dust like a serpent. Like the crawling things of the earth, they shall come trembling out of their strongholds. They shall turn in dread to the Lord our God, and they shall be in fear of you. What picture is that painting? Humiliated? Yeah. Devastated. So Micah uses that very same kind of idiom right there. Well, we know it's the Holy Spirit doing it. But so it would seem the terminology is really more metaphorical than literal in nature. In conclusion, then, on this passage, I'm persuaded the author of Genesis 3 seeking to illustrate the cursed nature of the demonic serpent, later identified as Satan, by referring to ground-crawling snakes. The author's saying that the serpent, who is the leader of a seditious cause to bring chaos to all that God has created, to try and undo his creation, if you will, is now cursed and faces certain defeat and humiliation, though he can still inflict wounds like striking someone's heel. Yes? In light of all that, the later Jewish and Christian traditions and writers were justified, I think, in linking this demonic creature with the prince of all demons, Satan. That seems to make sense, doesn't it? So that deals with the first passage. The next passage is Isaiah chapter 14, and I know you're familiar with this passage, and I'm sure you've got your own views on it. I just want to try and maybe fill in some question marks, because I think we can have a reasonable go at that. What's the context of Isaiah 14? Well, Israel's remnant is taunting Babylon, who will later on be the capturing nation of Judah, yes? Isaiah's writing to the northern kingdoms. They're about to go into captivity with the Assyrians. But later on, those in that Assyrian dispersion will later come under control of Babylon after the Assyrian Empire falls and Babylon takes its place. Okay, so and we know that at the end of the Babylonian dynasty, because of Daniel's accounts, especially Daniel 5, I'll refer to in a moment, we know that Babylon will fall. And who will replace Babylon as the new empire?
Assyria.
No, Persia. Assyria was before, and Persia will follow after. Okay, so that's important as well. We've got to link some text together. Okay, so this is a passage of prophecy against Babylon, who will be taunted by the Israelites in captivity when the Persians destroy their captors, Babylon. Okay, And it's a sign to them, or at least it was to Daniel, that soon, because Daniel remembered references in Jeremiah to the length of the captivity, but also to who would become God's instrument, okay, namely Cyrus, yeah, who would then, God would use not just to vanquish those nations like Babylon, but to also release his people and end the captivity. So that didn't escape Daniel. And Isaiah is the one who gets to prophesy it here. And boy, Babylon's end was swift, wasn't it? And ignominious. If you've read Daniel 5, do you remember the writing on the wall? What was going on when the writing appeared on the wall?
They were having a feast.
They were having a feast. King Belshazzar and all his nobles were having a feast. But what was unique about this feast? Do you remember?
They were using the things from the temple, or the tabernacle.
Yeah, they were using all the gold goblets and all the gold articles. He had them brought out of storage wherever they were, and they used those in his banquet. Now, what do you know about those articles?
They were holy.
They were holy. They were more than holy. They were most holy.
Yeah.
Consecrated purely for the work in the temple. Yeah? And they're gods. Now, if a king takes those things and he already has an attitude about him that he equates himself to God anyway, what do you think God thinks about that? With that high-handedness of how he uses those things.
I doubt that he was very happy about it.
No, I think it's what caused his ultimate downfall, the way it happened. And they were destroyed. The city, Babylon, was taken in a night. Some think by Darius, others by Gobryas, who was a vassal of, what's a vassal? One of the other leaders of the overall Persian army. But they got in through the moats and they took it in a night. And that was it. Belshazzar's never heard of again, nor his nobles. So it seems like that's the historical thing that's being referred to here. Okay, here's a king who's equaling himself to God, to Jehovah. So let's read verse 12 of Isaiah 14 and following. How you have fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend. By the way, that other word for north in the Hebrew is zaphon. Okay, just hold that thought because I'm going to mention something about that in a moment. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like who? El Elyon, the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, the far reaches of the pit. And I kind of wonder whether that's an allusion to Tartarus. In 2 Peter 2:4, those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook the kingdoms, who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities, who did not let its prisoners go home? Oh dear. But you, verse 19, are cast down away from your grave like a loathed branch. And on it goes. Okay. It seems like it's alluding to someone more than human, doesn't it? Which is not unfamiliar. I mean, you know, God uses metaphor and other literary instruments as he pleases to get a message across. But it seems to me like there may be an allusion to another fallen being. The day star, which traditionally, certainly in history, is associated with which planet? Do you know? Venus. Yeah. Venus is seen rising early in the morning at certain times in the astronomical calendar. So it rises in the early morning, but what happens when the light comes up, the sun comes up? It suddenly fades to nothing and you don't see it anymore. Right? So he uses that figure.
It's the first star we see at night, isn't it?
It could be. I'm not so up on the stars, but yeah, I know it's often in the sky, but others, but yeah. But anyway, that's how it's looked at. There seems like there's a curious association of the God-created natural behavior of this bright morning star with something rebellious. And I think that's significant. One of the recurring themes of the conflict myths of the nations around Israel, again, is that of a young God who aspires to advance himself beyond his powers and beyond his appropriate domain. And he's always vanquished in those stories. In several contexts, this God is associated with Venus. For example, there's a myth about a Canaanite god called Athtar the Rebel, who wanted to rule on the throne of Baal, the supreme god. Unfortunately, he was too small for the throne. His feet didn't reach the footstool, and his head didn't reach the headrest. And apparently, in frustration, he says, "I will not reign on the reaches of Zaphon." Ah, the sacred mountain. That was what was in that passage we just read. Instead, he is given rulership over the earth, which they called the underworld, a much smaller affair that he could presumably handle. Yes, it's a story, it's a myth, but there's certain things in there that are useful if you're trying to reach the nations around. Remember what I said was the purpose of going to taking things out of their culture, because it struck a chord with the hearer. Ooh, but God always changed one detail in their myths. When there needed to be a vanquisher or a conqueror or a winner, it was always Jehovah that the Hebrew writers would refer to, which wasn't in the other people's myths, of course. So it was kind of a winsome thing to put in there. What is interesting about this story is that Athtar's name, do you know what it means? No, you don't. Have a guess. Have a guess what Athtar means.
Short.
Sure. No. It means, yes, shining one, son of dawn. Now, isn't that interesting? Is that just a coincidence, do you think? I don't believe in coincidences. What's interesting about this story also is that on another occasion, this God's rebellion ends with him being vanquished by the sun, which makes sense, doesn't it? Understood against that background, Isaiah's poetry takes on new significance. The very fact that Isaiah associates the rising morning star with an act of rebellion would suggest that he is tapping into some dimension of Near Eastern conflict narrative. And he's using that purposely. Okay? Then he further specifies that this rising star wanted to rise above the stars of El. And what does El mean? Yeah, God. And sit enthroned on the recesses of Zaphon, this sacred mountain of assembly, which we call Zion, don't we? It is in the later texts, and become like, and the words in the Hebrew, in the Canaanite are El Yon, very similar to El Elyon, isn't it? Lord Most High. All of which play a role in Canaanite stories of Athtar. That seems to strengthen the conviction that Isaiah is intentionally drawing from familiar Canaanite themes. Who had Israel vanquished to gain their land? The Canaanites. Yeah. So they were only too familiar with these people because they didn't vanquish them completely, did they? Some of the tribes that made up the Canaanites, they didn't get rid of, like the Jebusites and some others. And they became a thorn in their side, if you remember. he's making a point to his audience. That the future king of Babylon will misuse his God-given power, that's Belshazzar, the last king of Babylon, in direct rebellion to God, because he misused the sacred treasure of the temple, amongst other things. He will thus fit the figure of a cosmic rebel. And when you get to the drama of Daniel 5, it all fits together, okay? And you see that this Belshazzar, although he's an illegitimate king, he's a participant and he's a prototype of a much bigger drama, okay, of another oppressive conqueror who attempted to set up an illegitimate reign, but on a cosmic scale, on a universal scale. And I wonder who that would be. In the words of Bertolucci, this passage about one particular hostile king also points toward, in his words, an archetype of the political and religious powers which through the ages are hostile to God and his people. Later church traditions seem quite justified in identifying the Hebrew Hillel ben Shaham. In the Vulgate, do you know what that's translated as, the day star? The Latin 4th century version of the Bible. That's in the Vatican there. Lucifer. That's where the name Lucifer comes from. Interesting, isn't it? And that's the name that's associated with Satan. There's one other passage I want to spend a bit of time in, and we find that in Ezekiel chapter, I think it's 28. Let me go there. The lament for the country of Tyre begins in the previous chapter, 27. And it goes on for a couple of chapters, but chapter 28 is where I want to focus a bit of time and energy in the time we've got left. In a similar way to Isaiah 14, this passage seems to say things about a mere human king of Tyre that are not really applicable to a mere human being. He's said, for instance, in verse 3 of chapter 28, to be wiser than Daniel. Indeed, no secret is hidden from him, or from you, is in my text. No secret. That sounds a bit more than a human would be able to do. He sees himself as having the mind of God in verse 6. And I think may use the word heart as well. And even refers to himself as God in verse 2. Yet you are but a man and no God. But he sat in the seat of the gods and he said, I am a God. Okay, little g. So that's kind of the preparation for what comes. We're more interested in the passage that follows in verse 12 through 17. Let's see what he says there. Son of man, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre and say to him, thus says the Lord God, you were the signet of perfection. Perfection. It seems like that's a good translation of the Hebrew. It's a difficult term. Full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. Sardis, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald, carbuncle, and crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. Almost sounds high priestly, doesn't it? On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, till unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire, because your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor, and I cast you to the ground. I exposed you before kings to feast their eyes on you. And on it goes. Does that sound like it's talking about a mere human being? I mean, there's a lot of metaphor in there, if it is. But it didn't escape the attention of the early church that this passage was an allusion to Satan. They jumped on it in a big way. What do you think? It's interesting language, isn't it? It certainly gives us information about the garden that we don't find anywhere else, whoever it's describing. The Edenic otherworldly references seem to be more than just Semitic or Hebrew hyperbole, and maybe someone other than the king of Tyre is being alluded to. The mention of Edom and the cherub, however, suggests that features of these cosmic conflict stories have been combined with elements of the Genesis account of the fall of humans as well. In this case, I'm persuaded that it is the case. And if that's so, then this is a very clear or very clever literary device that the author is employing to depict the fall of a cosmic being, isn't it? Powerful, yeah? Powerful. Just as the future fall of the king of Tyre will be profound in significant ways for the surrounding nations. What was Tyre known for? It was a port city. Shipping and trade. If Tyre falls, which I believe it did in the time of Alexander the Great, I believe that the main fortress was out on an island. And Alexander spent enough time to build a causeway out to it so that he could finish them off, is how the story goes. But Tyre was essential for trade. They were on the key trade route. So if Tyre's destroyed, what happens to everybody else? They're going to suffer, aren't they, as a consequence? But I'm persuaded that there's more than just the king of Tyre in focus here. I think there's a bigger conflict that's being referred to. So, in light of let me just say something else. What does a guardian cherub look like? What does a guardian cherub look like? I mean, if I was going to compare that to anybody, I'd be thinking of an archangel. I don't know what you think. You need to come to your own conclusion on that. But I think Satan was obviously very senior. He had a very high place. He had great responsibility. A guardian? What was he guarding? What was he guarding? I wonder if he was guarding the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Ooh. And what did he do with that responsibility? Food for thought, isn't it? So, a very senior angelic being, yeah, at the very least. The model of perfection before his fall. In light of our previous studies, what lends more credence to this speculation is that in the passages that follow, like chapter 29, we have a prophecy and a lament against Egypt, against Pharaoh. And it's not a surprise to me that the writer uses another cosmic character to compare Pharaoh to, a great sea monster. In chapter 29, verse 3. Behold, I'm against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt. The great, what does your version say? Dragon that lies in the midst of his streams, that says, my Nile is my own, I made it for myself. I will put hooks in your jaws and make the fish of your streams stick to your scale, blah, blah, blah. The great dragon. I don't think anyone's caught one of those in the Nile recently, do you? I wonder what that's an allusion to. And then in chapter, where is it? 32, I think, chapter 32, still talking about Pharaoh, verse 2. Okay, it starts there. Son of man, raise a lamentation over Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say to him, you consider yourself a lion of the nations, but you're like a dragon in the seas. You burst forth in your rivers, trouble the waters with your feet, and foul their rivers. So he says, I'm going to throw my net over you with a host of many peoples, and they will haul you up in a dragnet, my dragnet, and I'll cast you on the ground, on the open field, I'll fling you, and will cause all the birds of the heavens to settle on you, and I will gorge the beasts of the whole earth with you. Ugh, I'll strew your flesh upon the mountains, and the valleys will, the carcass will lie. What was that picture? Not just the demise of Pharaoh, this dragon, that seems to be a reference to somebody else, I think, or an allusion to it. So there are accounts of Canaanite battles between the god Marduk, or Baal, and Tiamat, or Yam, which are the sea in two different nations, Canaanite and Mesopotamian myth. The only difference is that Yahweh is the conqueror in this account. The monster will be captured with a hook and fed to the beast, or captured with a net and destroyed. And everybody, all the birds of the air and beasts of the field will gorge on it. It seems as though Ezekiel sees the overthrow of God's present historical enemies as examples of his overthrowing of his cosmic enemies. Do you remember we talked about the human battles that Israel fought oftentimes are depicted as having a corollary? Some other battle was going on. Do you remember what was the noise, the rustling in the tops of those trees? When you hear that, know that I'm vanquishing your enemy, God says. So I see that picture here as well. If a king or Pharaoh's fall is intimated as being about to happen, it will be of the same impact as Satan's fall. And indeed, we can say, how great was his fall, yes? How did Jesus describe Satan in, is it Matthew? No, I can't remember if it's Matthew 10, I think it's Luke 10, when the 72 disciples came back from their limited commission. Remember what he said? I saw Satan. I saw Satan fall.
Like lightning.
Yeah, like lightning. That's quick, isn't it? Hey, boy, did he hit that ground with a crash. And that's what do you think Jesus was referring to? Yeah, for sure. So, and Jesus had given his disciples for that limited commission. What did he say he'd given them? Authority over what? Demons. I mean, he gave them authority to heal as well, but he gave them authority over demons so that they could cast down demons. So powerful, and we'll talk some more about that in one or two of the following lessons. So, in summary, then, of this Old Testament deal, these two prophetic passages are spoken of as both lamentations, both of them, lamentations for someone who'd gone wrong. And both passages depict someone who was created great, who became prideful in his heart and rebellious in his spirit, and who was then cast down or cast out. Something similar can maybe be inferred about the pride of Yam, the waters. Do you remember we talked about the waters in Job, that God said, you shall progress, but no further. I will put a line, a bar and you shall not go beyond it, except for the occasion where God used the waters as an instrument of his judgment of the world in the flood. But at the end of that time, he quite clearly commands the waters now return and don't come back. Go back beyond the lines that I gave you. Okay, so that's quite powerful to me. Rahab, Leviathan, the great dragon of the water, maybe those are exemplified in some of these passages and other passages as well. These cosmic forces, it seems, they ought not to be forces of chaos and destruction. That wasn't what God designed them to be, created them to be. And what's more, God ought not to have to oppose them. That wasn't his plan either. All of this has really significant repercussions for our understanding of the problem of evil. While the Old Testament is laying the foundation for seeing evil as, I'm persuaded, originating in the heart of free will creatures, okay, human and divine, it is certainly disallowing any understanding of evil as an eternal feature of the cosmos or of God. I just said something really important. Did you catch it? What did I say that evil is not? It's not forever. It's not eternal. Okay? It doesn't appear to me from all of what we've studied. We've done quite an extensive study of Old Testament passages, to be honest. We've covered a wide range of different topics. I don't see evil as being eternal. If it is, then we've got a problem, because how does that affect the character of God? Who is the only pre-existing eternal being? The Spirit, God. So, and he says so, doesn't he? We've looked at some of the scriptures that tell us that. So if you've got the idea that evil was also pre-existent, eternal, then somebody's lying. Or maybe we just aren't understanding the text well enough, and we need to know that more study.
But hell is eternal.
Yes.
Not evil.
Okay. What are you going to do with that?
Well, it's eternal.
We don't have to worry about it.
No, but it is existing.
Was it created or not created? I can't, I'll be honest with you, I'm not going to try and answer that question right now, because that's not been the focus of any of my study. I think we'll get into it. Let's leave it there for now, because one of the things we're definitely going to tackle is what Jesus says to Peter and the disciples in Matthew 16.
Y'all can settle that at the house.
Yeah.
Y'all settle that at the house.
Yes, we'll settle that at the house.
We have other stuff to say.
I nearly came here on my own tonight. For the same reason you did the other week. Yes. Let's listen to Peter. Yes.
This is one of the subjects about which we wish we had an entire book. Here's what all of this, okay, it's not fed out that way through the
No,
Bible.
it isn't.
Okay, but that does not, it doesn't change the fact that there's enough there that you know what's going on. We may have some here and there.
Yeah.
But anybody that doesn't recognize that there's an evil, okay, and that it's pervasive, and that it's against God, and it's going to lose, and it's already lost. Okay, you can say, well, I'm not really quite that sure about that. Don't worry about the things you can't see.
Right.
Worry about the things you do know.
Yeah.
Okay, and you've laid out, absolutely that there are beings and there is a cosmic war. It has been going on since the beginning, and they are losing, and they are going to finally be done away with.
Right.
And I personally have changed my entirely view about whether this is going to be a long time or whether this is going to be a within time. I think it is. I think we're coming
Short time.
toward the end, because the evil that is being put out from all sides with all the power at their disposal. God says, I'm not going to put up with that to all things, and all those nations that went under all learned the hard way that he was serious about it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a discussion in itself. And I remember having a long discussion with one or two other students at Sunset and Ed Wharton. What do you do with that passage in 2 Peter chapter 3? And maybe that will be in one of my closing classes, that talks about how the world's going to end and everything, even the elements are going to be burnt up, and what kind of people we ought to be now that we have that knowledge. It ought to be a motivation to us, doesn't it? Because otherwise we're given into Satan, and he's going to cause so much collateral damage that didn't need to be. Didn't need to be. And on that day, people are going to be screaming at us, saying, why didn't you tell us?
Right.
We would have listened. We would have listened. We would have listened. It's too late. And I have a funny feeling that some of us are going to have a sinking feeling in our hearts that, I wish I'd done more. And I don't want to stand before God that day. I'm wishing that I'd done more. Do you? I'd like to be more like Paul Hill, or someone like that who just is indefatigable. He gets up every day praying and thinking about how can I reach so and so, and he's fearless. He's going to try and convert the mayor. The mayor has promised he's going to come to the building now to see this fantastic wall. I mean, he's had studies with the guy who built the special masonry wall there. He's determined to convert him, but he's going to have a go at the mayor as well. The powers and the principalities, he's for it. And I just want a bit of what Paul has to rub off on me, a bit more. Don't you all want that? Hey, bet you can't want that, really. And I know you do a lot of good, so I don't want to criticise you, but evil, I'll finish with this. Evil is from the start of the Bible in Genesis construed as a tragic intrusion into God's otherwise good creation. And I believe that because of how the Bible finishes in Revelation 21 and 22. Because there's a new heavens and a new earth, and all that kind of language tells us that he's going to put right all wrongs.
Sure.
Yeah.
In his
So-
time, it is
In his time. But maybe not a long time.
Not a long time.
Where do you think we are on the clock?
I think we're,
Think we're at 11? Yep. Oh boy.
I do.
Maybe a bit later, eh? Any questions before we finish?